Danny Cole had worked on Frontier Station 12 for 3 years. And in all that time, he had never heard a sound quite like the one coming from behind the damaged cargo containers in Sector 9. It was not a mechanical noise, not the hum of broken equipment or the hiss of a leaking pipe, but something alive, something afraid, and something trying very hard not to be found. He stood alone in the dim light of the lower cargo bay, his scanner forgotten in his hand, as he listened to that strange whimpering sound that seemed to cut right through the silence around him. Every reasonable thought in his head told him to call security, to report the anomaly, and let armed officers handle whatever was hiding in the shadows of this forgotten corner of the station. But Danny had spent his whole career studying alien life forms, and he knew the difference between the sound of a predator hunting and the sound of a creature in pain. This was pain, pure and simple, mixed with fear that seemed almost desperate in its intensity. He moved slowly toward the source of the sound, his boots making soft clicks against the metal floor as he stepped around broken crates and scattered debris from a shipping accident that had happened weeks ago. The cargo bay had been scheduled for cleanup, but budget cuts and staff shortages meant that places like this often stayed forgotten for months at a time. Danny rounded a corner made of stacked containers and stopped breathing for a moment. When he saw what was hiding there was a Crethany cub, barely larger than a medium-sized dog, with scales that shimmered between deep purple and black even in the low light. The creature's eyes, all 4 of them, fixed on Danny with an expression that he recognized instantly, despite never having seen a Crethany in person before. Those eyes held terror, not the cold calculation of a hunter, but the raw fear of a child who had been lost and hurt and alone for far too long. Danny felt his heart pound against his ribs as his mind raced through everything he knew about the Crethany species. They were apex predators, feared across every corner of the galaxy for their hunting abilities and their complete lack of mercy toward other species. Their adults could tear through reinforced steel with their claws, and their young were considered even more dangerous because they acted on pure instinct without any of the restraint that older Crethany learned. Every protocol, every training manual, every survival guide he had ever read told him exactly what to do in this situation. He should run. He should call for help. He should put as much distance as possible between himself and his creature before its predator instincts kicked in. But Danny did not run. Instead, he looked more closely at the cub and saw the dark fluid seeping from a wound on its back leg, saw the way its ribs showed through its scales, saw the trembling that shook its small body. This was not a predator waiting to strike. This was a child who was starving and injured and terrified of what might happen. Next, Danny thought about his own niece back on Earth, only 6 years old, and how she looked when she woke up from nightmares and needed someone to tell her that everything would be okay. He knew it was crazy to compare a human child to a Crethany cub, knew that every scientist and soldier in the galaxy would call him insane for what he was about to do, but Danny had always believed that fear was the same in every language, and compassion did not need translation. He lowered himself slowly to the ground, making his body as small and non-threatening as possible, and he began to speak in a soft voice that he hoped would carry calmness instead of danger. "Hey there, little one," he said quietly, keeping his hands visible and his movements gentle. "I am not going to hurt you, I promise." The cub hissed at him, a weak sound that was probably meant to be threatening, but came out more like a desperate plea to be left alone. Danny did not move closer, did not reach out, did not do anything that might be seen as aggressive. He just sat there on the cold metal floor and kept talking in that same soft voice, telling the cub about nothing in particular, just letting the sound of his words fill the space between them. Minutes passed, maybe 10 or maybe 30. Danny lost track as he focused entirely on the small creature, watching him from the shadows slowly. So slowly that he almost missed it at first. The cub's trembling began to ease just a little. The hissing stopped, replaced by that same whimpering sound that had drawn Danny here in the first place. He reached into his pocket with careful movements and pulled out the ration bar he had brought for his lunch. A simple block of nutrients that tasted like cardboard but would keep a human going for hours. Danny broke off a small piece and placed it on the floor between them, then pulled his hand back and waited, the cub's 4 eyes fixed on the food with an intensity that told Danny everything he needed to know about how long this child had been without a meal hunger won out over fear. And the cub crept forward on 3 legs, keeping its injured limb raised, and snatched the food so quickly that Danny barely saw it move. The cub retreated to its corner and devoured the ration piece in seconds, then looked at Danny with an expression that seemed almost confused. He could imagine what the cub was thinking, because every instinct the Crethany possessed told them that other species either attacked or ran away, but this strange soft creature was doing neither of those things. It was just sitting there, offering food, speaking in gentle sounds that held no threat. Danny broke off another piece of the ration bar and held it out a little closer this time. "Come on," he said softly. "I have more if you want it." The cub hesitated, its 4 eyes blinking in what might have been surprise or suspicion or both, but hunger was a powerful force. And Danny watched as the small predator took a cautious step toward him. Then another. When the cub took the food from his hand, its claws brushing against his palm without breaking skin. Danny felt something shift in the air between them. He had just done what every being in the galaxy would call unthinkable. He had chosen compassion over fear, and somehow he was still alive to wonder what would happen next. The cub settled down a little closer to him than before, still watching, still wary, but no longer trembling quite so hard. Danny smiled and offered another piece of food, knowing that he had just started something that would change everything. He did not know yet how right he was. The alarm that rang through Frontier Station 12 was the kind that made everyone stop what they were doing and feel their blood run cold. Commander Laura Green stood on the command deck with her hands gripped tight on the railing as she watched the massive shape drop out of hyperspace on the main view screen. It was a Crethany warship, all sharp angles and dark metal, bristling with weapons that could turn the station into floating debris in a matter of minutes. "They are hailing us," announced the communications officer, his voice shaking despite his efforts to stay professional. Laura took a deep breath and nodded for him to open the channel. The voice that came through the speakers was deep and rough, filled with a barely controlled rage that made everyone on the command deck take an involuntary step back. "You have taken something that belongs to us," the Crethany voice growled. "Return what is ours, or we will take everything you have, including your lives." The channel closed before Laura could respond, and silence fell over the command deck like a heavy blanket. She turned to face the 2 people standing behind her, the xenobiologist Danny Cole and security officer Megan Shaw, who had just finished explaining the most unbelievable story she had ever heard. "Let me understand this correctly," Laura said in a voice that was carefully controlled. "You found a Crethany cub on my station, and instead of reporting it immediately, you spent hours feeding it and treating its wounds." "Commander, there was no time to," Danny started. But Laura held up her hand to stop him. "And now there is a warship out there crewed by the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. And they think we kidnapped their child," she continued, her eyes hard with stress and frustration. "They are wrong," Danny said firmly. "We did not kidnap anyone. We rescued a lost child who was hurt and starving. Do you think they will care about the difference?" Laura demanded, gesturing at the view screen where the Crethany ship hung like a dark promise of violence. "Their young are sacred to them, and they believe we have harmed one of their own." The cub was in a secure room 2 levels below, watched over by a medical team that was terrified, but professional enough to keep their fear from affecting their work. Danny had not wanted to leave it, But Lavra had insisted that he explain himself in person before she made any decisions. "Commander, I have an idea," Danny said, his voice steady even though his heart was racing. "Let me take the cub to them myself." Lara stared at him as if he had just suggested walking into a furnace. "You want to board a Crethany warship," she said slowly, "alone and unarmed with their cub." "Yes," Danny replied without hesitation. "That is suicide," Megan cut in, her face pale with worry. "Danny, they will kill you the moment you step through their airlock." "Maybe," Danny admitted. "But if we try anything else, if we send soldiers or make demands or act like we have something to hide, they will definitely attack this station." He stepped closer to the commander, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "I am the one who found the cub, the one who helped it, the one it trusts," he said. "If anyone has a chance of making them listen, it is me." Lavra was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing through every possible option and finding none that seemed better than what Danny was proposing. "You understand that I cannot order you to do this," she finally said. "I cannot promise that Anthropic Command will not consider your actions a violation of about 50 different protocols." "I understand," Danny said, "but that cub trusted me when every instinct told it to run or fight. And I will not betray that trust by hiding behind soldiers and letting fear make this situation worse." Something flickered in Laura's eyes, something that might have been respect or might have been resignation. "Go," she said quietly, "and may whatever gods you believe in go with you." Danny nodded and turned to leave. But Megan grabbed his arm before he could take more than 2 steps. "Danny, wait," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "You cannot just walk in there alone." "I have to," he said gently, covering her hand with his own. "The Crethany will see any armed escort as a threat. I need to show them that humans are not their enemies." He gave her a small smile that he hoped looked braver than he felt. "Besides, someone has to stay here and explain to the commander how we ended up in this mess." Megan did not laugh at his weak attempt at humor, but she did let go of his arm. "If you die, I'm going to be very angry with you," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I will keep that in mind." Danny promised. He made his way down to the medical level, where the cub was waiting in a room that had been hastily cleared of anything that might seem threatening. The moment Danny walked through the door, the small creature let out a sound of recognition and moved toward him, its injured leg moving better now thanks to the treatment it had received. "Hey there, little one," Danny said softly, crouching down to meet the cub at eye level. "We are going to take a little trip to see your family." The cub seemed to understand something in his tone, because it pressed close to his side and made that soft questioning sound again. Danny ran his hand gently over the cub's scales, marveling at how something that the entire galaxy feared could feel so small and fragile under his touch. "I do not know if this is going to work," he admitted quietly, more to himself than to the cub, "but I know that I have to try." He stood up and walked toward the docking bay with the cub beside him, and with every step he could feel the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on his shoulders. The corridor to the airlock seemed longer than he remembered, and the faces of the people he passed were filled with expressions that ranged from confusion to horror to something that looked almost like awe. No one tried to stop him, though he could see that many wanted to when he reached the docking bay, where a small shuttle would carry him to the Crethany vessel. He paused and looked back at the station that had been his home for 3 years. Then he stepped into the shuttle with the cub at his side, and as the doors closed behind him, Danny Cole prepared to do something that no human had ever done before. He was going to walk into the den of the galaxy's greatest predators and hope that kindness was stronger than fear. 3 hours had passed since Danny first found the cub hiding in the cargo bay, and in that time something remarkable had happened to the small Crethany, who Danny had started calling Little One in his mind. had moved close enough that he could see every detail of its scaled face. Its 4 eyes no longer held pure terror. Instead, they watched him with something that looked almost like curiosity. As if the cub was trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense, Danny had given the creature all of his ration bar and then the emergency food pack from his belt pouch. And now he was working on the most difficult part of his unplanned mission. The wound on the cub's leg was infected. The dark fluid around it carrying a smell that told Danny this injury was days old at least. He pulled out his emergency medical kit and opened it slowly, showing each item to the cub before using it, talking constantly in that same calm voice. "This is going to help you feel better," he said as he prepared the antiseptic spray. "It might sting a little, but I need you to trust me." "Okay." The cub watched his hands with intense focus. Muscles tensed and ready to bolt at the first sign of danger, Danny moved with exaggerated slowness, letting the cub see everything he was doing, never making sudden movements that might trigger those predator instincts. When he finally touched the wound, the cub flinched and let out a sharp cry that made Danny's heart ache, but it did not attack. Did not slash at him with those claws that could easily tear through his soft human skin. Instead, it held still, trembling again, trusting this strange creature who had shown nothing but kindness since the moment they met. Danny cleaned the wound as gently as he could, applied the antiseptic that made the cub whimper, and then wrapped it in a bandage that would keep the injury protected. When he was finished, the cub looked down at its leg with obvious confusion, then back at Danny with those 4 blinking eyes. "There," Danny said with a tired smile. "That should help it heal properly." The cub made a sound then. Not a hiss or a whimper, but something softer, almost like a question. Danny wished he understood Crethany language, wished he could explain that he meant no harm and only wanted to help, but words were not the only way to communicate. And somehow the cub seemed to understand his intentions better than any translation could convey. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cargo bay, and Danny felt his stomach drop as he recognized the sharp click of security boots on metal. "Danny, where are you?" called a familiar voice that belonged to Megan Shaw, his colleague and one of the station's security officers. He wanted to answer, wanted to warn her to approach slowly. But before he could speak, Megan rounded the corner and stopped dead in her tracks. Her hand flew to the weapon at her hip, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the scene before her. "What in the name of every star?" she breathed, her voice tight with disbelief and fear. "Danny, get away from that thing right now." "Megan, wait," Danny said quickly, holding up his hands to stop her from drawing her weapon. "It is not what you think, not what I think," Megan repeated, her voice rising with each word. "That is a Crethani, Danny. A juvenile predator that could kill you before you even saw it move." The cub had pressed itself against Danny's side at the sound of Megan's sharp voice, and he could feel it trembling again. All the progress he had made over the past 3 hours was in danger of being destroyed by one wrong move. "Look at it," Danny said firmly, keeping his voice calm despite the tension in the air. "Really look at it, Megan." Megan's eyes moved from Danny to the cub, and he watched as her expression slowly shifted from fear to confusion. The cub was not crouching to attack, was not baring its teeth or extending its claws. It was hiding behind a human like a frightened child, seeking protection from a threat it could not face alone. It was separated from its clanship during a pirate attack, Danny explained, the words coming from fragments of communication the cub had managed to convey through gestures and broken sounds. "It has been alone and injured and starving in this cargo bay for days, maybe longer." Megan did not lower her hand from her weapon, but she did not draw it either. "Danny, do you have any idea what will happen when the Crethany find out we have one of their young on this station?" she asked, her voice quieter now but still tense with worry. "Yes," Danny admitted. "And that is exactly why we need to handle this carefully. He looked down at the cub, who was watching Megan with wary eyes, but had not made any aggressive moves. "If we hurt this cub or treat it like a prisoner, the Crethany will destroy this station and everyone on it," Danny said. "But if we show them that we helped their child when it was lost and alone, maybe, just maybe, we can turn this into something other than a disaster." Megan stared at him for a long moment, and Danny could see the war happening behind her eyes. Every bit of her training told her to contain the threat, to protect the station, to follow protocols that existed for very good reasons. But she was also a person who had grown up with younger siblings, who understood what it meant to protect someone small and scared and helpless. "You are out of your mind," she finally said. But her hand dropped away from her weapon. Danny let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. "Probably," he agreed. "But I could not just leave it here to die." Megan moved closer, slowly enough that the cub did not panic, and crouched down to get a better look at the small creature. "It really is just a baby, is it not?" she said softly, something in her voice shifting toward wonder instead of fear. The cub watched her approach with caution but did not flee, perhaps sensing that this new human was connected to the one who had shown such unexpected kindness. "We need to tell Commander Green," Megan said, standing up again with a heavy sigh, "before someone else finds out and causes a panic." Danny nodded, knowing she was right but dreading the conversation that was about to happen. "Help me get it somewhere safe first," he said. "Somewhere quiet where it will not be scared by crowds of people." Megan looked at him, then at the cub, then back at him with an expression that mixed exasperation with something that might have been respect. "Follow me," she said, "and pray that you know what you are doing, because if this goes wrong, we are all going to be in more trouble than you can possibly imagine." Danny stood slowly, and to his amazement the cub stood with him, staying close to his side, as if it had decided that this human was the only safe thing in a universe that had been nothing but cruel, as they walked through the cargo bay toward whatever came next. Danny made a silent promise to the small creature beside him. He would not let anything happen to it, no matter what the galaxy threw at them. Danny extended his hand without hesitation, even though he could see the blade still wet with Crethany blood. Rickstar took his wrist with surprising gentleness for a creature so large and powerful, and with one quick motion drew the edge across Danny's palm. The pain was sharp but brief, and Danny watched as his own red blood welled up from the cut. The Crethany father then pressed their wounds together, his dark blood mixing with Danny's bright red, and spoke words in a language that Danny did not understand but that seemed to resonate through the very walls of the ship. The warriors around them lowered their heads in what looked almost like respect, and the cub let out a sound that was unmistakably joyful. "It is done," Rickstar announced, releasing Danny's hand but holding his gaze with those intense eyes. "By the ancient laws of my people, you are now clan-bonded, brother to the Crethany, protector of our blood." Danny stared at his wounded palm, watching the two different colors of blood still mingling together, trying to comprehend what had just happened. "I do not understand," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved my offspring when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose," Rickstar explained, his voice carrying a weight that silenced any remaining murmurs in the chamber. "This is not the act of prey, not the behavior of the weak creatures we believed humans to be." The massive Crethany stepped back and surveyed Danny with new eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. "My people have misunderstood your kind," Rickstar continued. "We saw softness and assumed weakness. We saw compassion and assumed cowardice. We were wrong." He gestured at his offspring, who now sat proudly at Danny's feet like a guardian rather than a creature being guarded. "To walk into certain death to protect the child of your enemy requires a courage that few possess," Rickstar said. "To show kindness when violence would be easier takes a strength that we fail to recognize." Then he felt something warm spread through his chest. Something that was not quite relief, but felt close to it. "What happens now?" he asked, finally finding his voice again. "Now you return to your station with my respect and the respect of my clan," Rick Star replied. "And the galaxy will learn that the Crethani have found something they never expected to find." "What is that, Danny?" asked Rick Star showed his teeth in what Danny was beginning to recognize as a smile. "Equals." The Krillini said. The journey back to Frontier Station 12 felt like a dream. And when Danny walked through the airlock with the mark of clan bond still fresh on his palm, he was greeted by faces frozen in disbelief. Commander Laura Green stood at the front of the crowd that had gathered, her expression torn between relief and amazement. "You are alive," she said, stating the obvious in a voice that suggested she had not expected to ever say those words. "I am," Danny confirmed, holding up his bandaged hand. "And I think I might have made us some new friends." The days that followed were chaos in the best possible way. News of what happened spread across the station first, then across the sector, then across the entire galaxy with a speed that left everyone struggling to keep up. The Crethani, feared by every species in known space, had accepted a human into their clan, and they had done so because that human showed their child kindness when cruelty would have been so much easier. Diplomatic channels that had been closed for centuries suddenly opened as other species tried to understand what this meant. Ambassadors arrived at the station wanting to meet the human who had walked into a predator's den and walked out as family. But Danny avoided the spotlight as much as he could, preferring to spend his time in the xenobiology lab or in the quiet moments when he could think about everything that had changed. 3 months after the incident, he received a message through channels that should not have been possible. It was from the cub, who had a name now that Danny could almost pronounce. Kirex. The message was short, translated into human language by someone on the Crethani ship, but it carried more meaning than any diplomatic speech could have conveyed. "I am strong now because of you." The message read, "I teach others about humans, about the soft creatures who are not soft at all, about the prey that chose to be protector. My father says you changed how we see the galaxy, but you changed me more. I will remember always." Danny read those words over and over, feeling something tight in his chest that might have been pride or might have been hope. He had not set out to change anything when he sat down beside a frightened cub in that cargo bay. He had just done what felt right, what felt human, but sometimes that was enough. In the months and years that followed, the story of the human and the predator cub became legend across the stars. Species that had dismissed humanity as soft and weak began to look at them differently, seeing strength where they had seen only vulnerability. The Crethani became unexpected allies, trading partners, and eventually friends to the human race in a relationship that no one had ever thought possible. And through it all, Danny Cole continued his work on Frontier Station 12, studying alien life forms and trying to understand the universe one discovery at a time. He kept the scar on his palm as a reminder of what had happened, of the moment when he had chosen compassion over fear and found himself changed forever. Sometimes, late at night when the station was quiet, he would look at that scar and remember a terrified cub hiding in the shadows of a cargo bay. Would remember the moment he decided to sit down instead of run, to offer food instead of calling for weapons, to see a child in need instead of a monster to be feared. That choice had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined, changing relationships between species and rewriting what the galaxy believed about humanity. And it had all started with one simple truth that Danny had always believed. Kindness was not weakness. Compassion was not cowardice. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was refuse to let fear make your choices for you. Across the galaxy, in ships and stations and worlds beyond counting, beings began to whisper a new warning about the species. Called human, do not mistake their gentleness for weakness. They said, because these are creatures who will walk into the den of predators to protect a child that is not their own. These are beings who choose mercy when violence would be easier, who offer help to enemies who have never shown them kindness. These are humans, and they are far more dangerous than anyone ever realized, not because of their weapons or their technology or their numbers, but because of their hearts. The interior of the Crethany warship was exactly as terrifying as Danny had imagined it would be. Air was thick and warm, carrying scents that his human nose could not identify, but that made something deep in his brain scream warnings of danger. The corridors were built for creatures larger than him, with ceilings that disappeared into shadow and walls that seemed to absorb the dim red light that provided the only illumination. Danny could hear them moving in the darkness around him, heavy footsteps and the scrape of claws against metal. Hunters watching from places he could not see. Every instinct he possessed told him to run, to hide, to do anything other than walk deeper into this place where death waited in every shadow. But the cub at his side pressed closer with each step, and Danny found strength in the small creature's trust. They had not killed him at the airlock, which was more than he had dared to hope for when he first stepped off the shuttle instead. A single Crethony guard had met him with weapons drawn and eyes full of suspicious fury, then led him into the ship without a word. Danny had expected to be searched, bound, perhaps beaten for information about what the humans had done to the cub, but the guard had simply walked ahead, leaving Danny to follow with the young Crethony padding along beside him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Now, they entered a large chamber that seemed to serve as some kind of meeting hall, and Danny's breath caught in his throat at what he saw waiting for him there. A dozen Crethony warriors stood in a circle around the room, their eyes gleaming in the low light, their massive forms radiating the kind of deadly power that made them legends throughout the galaxy. But it was the figure at the center of the room that held Danny's attention. This Crethony was larger than the others, covered in scars that told stories of countless battles survived, with eyes that burned with an intensity that made Danny feel like his very soul was being examined. This had to be Rickstar, the cub's father, and the rage rolling off him was almost physical in its force. "You," Rickstar growled, his voice echoing through the chamber like thunder. "You are the one who took my offspring." Danny forced himself to stand tall, to meet those terrible eyes without flinching. Even though his knees wanted to buckle and his heart was beating so hard, he thought it might burst. "I did not take anyone," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "I found your child alone and injured in a cargo bay. I helped because that is what my people do." Rickstar snarled, a sound that made every hair on Danny's body stand on end, and stepped closer until he towered over the small human lies. The Crethony hissed, "No species helps a predator's young. They flee or they attack. Those are the only choices." "Then my species is different," Danny replied, refusing to step back, even though everything in him screamed to put distance between himself and this apex killer, the cub, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes. Suddenly moved forward before Danny could stop it, walked toward its father on legs that no longer limped, thanks to the bandage still wrapped around its wound, and stopped directly between them. Rickstar looked down at his offspring, and for just a moment, Danny saw something other than rage in those fierce eyes. The cub began to make sounds, a complex series of growls and clicks and rumbles that Danny could not understand, but that clearly meant something to the Crethony gathered around them. Whatever the cub was saying caused a ripple of reaction through the warriors, expressions shifting from hostility to confusion to something that looked almost like shock. Rickstar's eyes snapped back to Danny, but now there was uncertainty mixed with the anger. "My offspring speaks of hunger and fear and injury," the Crethony father said slowly. "It speaks of a soft creature who did not run, who offered food from its own mouth, who touched the wound with gentle hands instead of weapons." Danny nodded. not trusting his voice to remain steady if he spoke. "Why?" Rickstar demanded, the word coming out like a challenge. "Why would you do this for a child of your enemies?" "Because you are not my enemies," Danny said, finding his voice again. We had never even met before today. How could we be enemies? He gestured at the cub, who was watching the exchange with obvious hope in its 4 eyes. "I saw a child in pain, scared and alone and dying slowly in a place where no one would find it," Danny continued. "I did not see a Crethany or a predator or a threat. I saw someone who needed help." Rickstar was silent for a long moment, his massive form still as stone as he processed what he was hearing. "You walked onto this ship knowing you would likely die," the Crethany said finally, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "You faced certain death to return a child that most species would have killed on sight. I made a promise." Danny said simply, "I told your child that I would not let anything bad happen to it. And I meant it." Something changed in Rickstar's eyes then, a shift that Danny could not quite read, but that made the other warriors in the room murmur among themselves. "You show no fear," Rickstar observed, tilting his great head to study Danny more closely. "I am terrified," Danny admitted with a small, tired laugh. "But being afraid does not mean I can ignore what is right." The cub made another sound, softer this time, and moved back to Danny's side to press against his leg in a gesture that was unmistakably affectionate. Everix watched this with an expression that seemed almost troubled, as if everything he believed about the universe was being challenged by what he was seeing. "Among my people," the Crethany father said slowly, "a debt is owed to one who saves a life, especially the life of a child." He reached to his belt and drew a blade that gleamed even in the dim light, its edge sharp enough to cut through bone without effort. Danny felt his heart stop, but he did not move, did not run, did not close his eyes against what he thought was coming. Rickstar raised the blade, and every muscle in Danny's body tensed for an end that he had known was always possible from the moment he first sat down beside a frightened predator cub. But the blade did not strike. Instead, Rickstar pressed it against his own palm and drew a thin line of dark blood, then looked at Danny with an expression that had transformed from rage into something far more complex. "Give me your hand, human," the Crethany commanded. And Danny realized with dawning amazement that he was not about to die. He was about to become something that no human had ever been before.